article, Christian Cruelty in the Face of COVID-19. Some of the most visible Christians in America are failing the coronavirus test. So this is all about people failing, according to Jonathan Merritt. So Jonathan Merritt is going to become the judge of what failure is. But the real question to me is, doesn't this article tell us more about Jonathan Merritt than it does anything else? I think it does. Let's see why. Consider the popular pastor John Piper, who was asked what he would say to pastors who claim that the pandemic is God's judgment on sinful cities and arrogant nations. Quote, God sometimes uses disease to bring particular judgments upon those who reject him and give themselves over to sin. End quote, Piper responded. And that's it. That's all he's going to say about Piper. Nothing about Piper's writings, theology, work, context, nothing. This was yellow journalism. It was, I'm going to be writing to people in the Atlantic that don't have a clue who John Piper is. And so I can determine the context for anybody I want to take a shot at and get everybody in this audience that will be mine to agree with me. And I don't even have to I don't even have to break a sweat. I don't even have to do much in the way of Google searching, let alone actual reading. I can just take shots all I want. And that's what he did. And so we need to hear this kind of a statement that is meant to be an argument but fails to actually function as an argument. Because evidently, by titling it the way that it's titled, this is a failure on John Piper's part. Well, what is the failure in saying that God sometimes uses disease to bring particular judgments upon those who reject him and give themselves over to sin? Didn't this happen many times in the scriptures? Didn't this happen even in the New Testament? Didn't God strike Ananias and Sapphira down? What happened to Herod? So there is a worldview that is being brought into play by Jonathan Merritt. He doesn't have to define it, and he doesn't have to defend it, but he can use it as a weapon against Christianity. And he gets the ears of the audience because he claims to be the Christian himself. So I'm on the inside. Let me tell you how bad we really are, to an audience that plainly and clearly is looking for every reason in the world to believe exactly that. He doesn't argue against what Piper says because it's self-evidently biblically true. Or perhaps look to R.R. Reno, the editor of the conservative Christian journal First Things, who argued that it's not worth a, quote, mass shutdown of society, end quote, just to fight the virus. Quote, there is a demonic side to the sentimentalism of saving lives at any cost, end quote, Reno wrote, decrying the, quote, ill-conceived crusade against human finitude and the dolorous reality of death, end quote. Well, that sounds like Reno is a real jerk. I went and found his article, and I read it. It was insightful and wise. And his argument was, we draw lines of necessity in regards to life and death every day. There have always been people in our midst who are immunocompromised, who have multiple underlying problems, and for some reason, 60,000 a year dying because their complicated situation becomes overcomplicated by influenza has never before caused us to shoot our civilization in the head before. And he's right. If you take it, if you think that mankind can control death, then we would all live in separate bubbles. We would never interact with one another. We would never accomplish anything. We would never do anything. And we'd still die, right? But that's what he was talking about. But you see, this is quote mining. This is how you put together, you know who your audience is. You know what's going to push their buttons. You know what's going to create emotion. It may not have anything to do with your target. So he did to Piper, so he did to Mueller. That's what he's doing here to Reno. This is a very popular form of non-journalism. And Merritt knows that he could never engage in any type of meaningful debate over these issues because Reno or any of these other people go, well, wait a minute, but I said that in this context. I said this in this context. Are you saying this? Are you? And once you get pressed, well, it's like, unwisely going on Tucker Carlson. It's just, you end up looking really bad by the time you get done with it. So, Merritt continues, COVID-19 has claimed nearly 50,000 lives in America thus far. I stopped for a moment. There was a lady on Twitter this morning that went after me. My first words to her is, you cannot reason with panic. And after I still attempted to reason with her and her response was completely irrational and completely emotional, that proved that I probably could have stopped right after the first few words that I wrote. But what I did do is I tried to provide to her some numbers from the CDC from 2017, so before all this stuff happened, as to how many people are dying every day, every hour, every minute in the United States, and what they die of. People don't know these things. I've shared them with you before on this program. Contextless numbers mean nothing. They mean nothing. Nearly 3 times that number, the number he gave right there, will die of Alzheimer's disease in 1 year in the United States. Alzheimer's. That's the same group, pretty much, right? Same group. And yet, there are a number of things that have been linked to the onset of Alzheimer's. Environmental things. How many people are running around focused upon avoiding any of those things? Most people don't even know what they are. But if your phone every 5 minutes gave you push notifications about someone else who died of Alzheimer's, you would be panicked about that, and you'd be willing to shut down all of your life to avoid that. That's what's happened here. That's what's different. And we could do that with influenza, and we could do that with meningitis, and we can do that with measles, and we can do that with all sorts of other things. All you got to do is put the spotlight on that thing and then hit everybody on Fox News and CNN and on your phone and in all your social media. Can you even go to a website today that doesn't start off with a splash screen about COVID-19? Good luck. I don't know where you'd find it. Everywhere I go. Even if it has nothing to do with anything related, it's still there. That's how you keep the panic going, keep the panic going, keep the panic going. So, COVID-19 has claimed nearly 50,000 lives in America thus far, if you trust those numbers. Those numbers are changing. I heard about hundreds that were removed from various lists today because they had been added under pressure, had been added without evidence. Most of those casualties died alone without so much as the dignity of a familiar face as they drifted into eternal rest. That's because of the lockdown stuff that many people in the medical community didn't understand either. Most of those who have died are grandparents and the immunocompromised, the weakest among us. We are a grief-stricken and disillusioned people. Like many others, I'm struggling to make sense of how those who follow the teachings of Jesus, known for healing the sick, could shrug their shoulders at mass death and heap pain on the grieving. Did you catch that? This kind of writing is not capable of making good old-fashioned honest arguments. So what it does is it slides them in unformed, unsubstantiated, but clothed in emotion, bathed in emotion. And for our society today, emotion and thought are the same thing. Emoting and thinking, same thing. No, they're not. And so you have emotional statements made, and then without substantiation, in purely slanderous form, the assertion that people who allegedly follow the teachings of Jesus could shrug their shoulders at mass death and heap pain on the grieving. Oh, who's that? John Piper? Who's doing this? You see, the idea is if you don't panic like us and buy our worldview and agree to diving face first into worldwide depression, which leads to war and disease and famine and everything else, then you are shrugging your shoulders at mass death and you want to heap pain on the grieving. Well, obviously John Piper doesn't want to do that. No one that was mentioned in the article at this point wants to do that. It is a cheap general shot, unsubstantiated, and a real editor would have pulled it. But this type of stuff doesn't really get edited. And I'm pulling quotes myself here. I'm not going to read the whole thing. Then he talks about his own experience in evangelicalism, which of course he's left. And he concludes by saying, but I'd never predicted that I would witness prominent Christian leaders dismissing death. So if you contextualize it, if you recognize how much death takes place every day, worldwide 1.8 people per second, 2.8 million in the United States each year. Break it down, get out your calculator. You'll get it. You figure that out. If you put that in context, that means you dismiss death. How was John Piper dismissing death? Well, he wasn't. He wasn't. But you see, what Jonathan Merritt detests is a God who has a sovereign purpose that he's accomplishing in this world. He goes on to say, a prominent church in Texas recently paid for a billboard to ask commuters, is coronavirus a judgment from God? Why just stop? That is a very valuable question. That is a valuable question. And my concern, sorry, but it was 19 years ago that I sat behind this microphone, not in this room, but it was 19 years ago that I, on the day after September 11th, raised the exact same question in regards to what had happened then. And anyone who has this in their hand cannot help but ask that question and seek to provide a balanced and meaningful answer. But that's only if you actually believe this to be the Word of God. If you don't, well, that's a different thing. And of course, he's writing to people who don't. Because let me read it again. A prominent church in Texas recently paid for a billboard to ask commuters, is the coronavirus a judgment from God? But that's not as bad as, so that's it. One sentence. No argumentation. See, you can only do this when you are only writing for one spectrum of people, and you don't care what anyone else thinks, and you don't care to be accurately representing the actual topic. But that's not as bad as Ralph Drollinger, the Christian minister who leads a Bible study for members of President Donald Trump's cabinet, who answered the question in the affirmative. He answered in the affirmative. In a series of blog posts, he argued the disease is God's consequential wrath on our nation, worrying that whenever an individual or corporate group of individuals violate the inviolate precepts of God's word, he, she, they, or the institution will suffer the respective consequences. Oh, no! Someone actually believes if you violate the precepts of God's word, judgment might come? How can that be? Robert Jeffress, now notice there's no argument against it. That's just, the argument is this is even worse than asking the question, is coronavirus a judgment of God? You're actually thinking that God's law still has relevance today. How dare you? See, but you're not stating it. You're just using the emotional approach to make the argument without actually making an argument. Robert Jeffress, another Christian minister close to Trump, echoed this idea by warning all natural disasters can ultimately be traced back to sin. Now, I'm not a big fan of Robert Jeffress. Okay, I'm not. I have seen too much of the red, white, and blue flag-waving stuff being confused for worship at his church. So no, thank you. But you really want to argue that statement? This is a fallen world. That has to do with sin. Therefore, the statement is self-evidently true. Their interpretation of recent events is not as uncommon as you might assume. You and me. You see the signaling? You know, the little head nod, the little winky winky, and we Atlantic readers, we're all in this together. One recent poll reports that some 44% of Americans say the pandemic is a wake-up call from God and signs of coming judgment. Well, that's actually encouraging. We'll see how long that lasts. Probably not very long. I'm not reading the whole thing, like I said. There's a whole thing about... Well, check this out. Ironically, the choice to emphasize these sorts of judgmental messages instead of stressing love and caring. Instead of... So if you believe in God's law, then you don't believe in love, and you can't care for anyone. You see how these arguments are made? It is costing the religion dearly. According to Lifeway research, 70% of Protestants stop attending church for at least a year from the ages of 18 to 22. Why did they leave? 26% said it was because church members were judgmental or hypocritical. An additional 15% said it was due to church members being unfriendly and unwelcoming. Christians' bad behavior has propped open their churches' back doors. Well, there are tons and tons of articles about that subject. But what does that have to do with coronavirus? All that stuff was well before coronavirus came along, right? This is just an opportunity to take a shot at the church. This is just an opportunity to take a shot at what he himself has apostatized from. Remember, the same thing's operating here that operates when you read Bart Ehrman. They're both apostates. It's just one still pretending, and the other one isn't. So I could, respond to a lot of what is said here, but notice, being unfriendly and unwelcoming. Folks, I've been an elder in a church for decades now, and let me tell you something. When you're on the inside, I guarantee you, what you're told as an elder by someone who leaves your church will be very different when they tell everybody else. And there's always two sides to that story. Always two sides to that story. But the point is, that is an irrelevant argument. It has nothing to do with coronavirus at all. It doesn't help that such high numbers of America's faithful, particularly white evangelicals and conservative Catholics, continue to publicly support a president who is emblematic of the very attributes that so many loathe about believers. So let's take a shot at Trump while we're at it. And in the process, let's not talk about the real issues. This was the same thing he did with Mueller, is he dug back into stuff from the 1990s rather than dealing with what Mueller said. What Mueller said was not anything about, I just think Donald Trump is a paragon of virtue. He didn't say that. What he does recognize, obviously, is the fact that the other party is a barely disguised front organization for the CCP. And if you don't know what the CCP is, you really need to get used to hearing that. Chinese Communist Party. They want world domination, and they're accomplishing it. They're accomplishing it financially. They're accomplishing it by investment. And that is an organization that has millions of its own people in gulags. People disappear in China all the time. The Chinese communists are just as evil as Stalin was or any of the rest. Just look at some history, if you would, please. So rather than actually dealing with substantive arguments, what he's gotten away with, because of who he's writing it to, is just to appeal to the prejudices of that group. And obviously what that means is the leftist elites function not on the basis of logical argumentation, but emotion. But last one I'll look at. Check this out. This is how he finished the article. The earmark of Christianity is kindness, compassion, and supernatural love. It's not fighting back, attacking enemies, settling scores, or leveraging other people's pain for your own advancement. Some of the most visible Christians in America, it seems, need to go back to Sunday school and discover the loving roots at the core of this great religion's message. I wonder, did Jonathan reread that paragraph and realize that's what he had just been doing? That the last two articles I've seen from him were fighting back, attacking enemies, settling scores, leveraging other people's pain for your own advantage. That's exactly what he's been doing, just in service of the left. That's what he's been doing. And when people get that deeply into something, sometimes they just can't even see it. They can't even see it themselves.